Welcome to Brothers of the Word, because, brother, you need the Word. And I am now in the middle of a series called The Plagues of Egypt. And this is a series that God had me to do in the middle of, because the very plagues of Egypt still has a significance in our lives today. We still have plagues in our lives today. And the first one was entitled simply Bumps Over Blessings, and how the first plague was really how we have a tendency sometimes to put our trials and our tribulation and our bumps over the blessings that God has given us. And the second one had to do with the plague that saves your life. And I preached part one of that particular plague on last week, and God says this plague takes two parts to even just preach about this plague, the plague that saves your life. And it begins with Abimelech, who was a king, and Abraham had gone into his country, and Sarah was a beautiful woman, and Abraham knew how beautiful she was, and he said, because my wife is so beautiful, the men there will kill me and take her. So let us tell the people that you are my sister, and therefore they won't kill me and they'll let me live. And that's what they did. And Abimelech saw Sarah and got Sarah, and he gave Abraham all this stuff, but there was a plague and a curse that came over Abimelech's household, and he had a dream, and in the dream God says, if you had touched this woman, surely you would be a dead man. And Abimelech went back to Abraham and said, man, why you do this to me? I'm innocent. I didn't know anything about it. Why you do this to me? But he ended up giving Abraham all of this stuff. And then I took you to the second part of that message 25 years earlier, when Abraham had gone into Egypt, and he'd done the same thing. He was worried about the Egyptians killing him and taking his wife. And he said, let's tell the people that you are my sister. And here in the first part of Abimelech, Genesis chapter 20, but that night God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, you are a dead man, for the woman you have taken is already married. And then for God had closed up all of the wombs of the women in Abimelech's household. And we go back 25 years earlier in Genesis chapter 12. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And this actually was the first true plague of Egypt. But the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Doesn't enumerate or detail what those plagues are. It just says they were terrible. And when God says it's terrible, it's about pretty bad. I don't know what they were, but I really rather not have anything to do with terrible plagues. But in this instance, the plague saved Pharaoh's life. And if it had not have been for the plagues, Pharaoh could have been killed because he would have fooled with another man's wife. But here the plague saved his life. And I'm here to tell you, not only did the curse save Pharaoh's life, but it blessed him beyond measure. And I know you're looking at me strange and you say, how? How did this plague, I can see it saving his life, but how did it bless him beyond measure? Pharaoh was already the most powerful man in the land, and at that time in the most powerful and the most prosperous country on the face of the earth. How did this bless him beyond measure? How did a plague bless him beyond measure? And this is what it's entitled, the plague that saves your life. Sometimes the things that we think are so rough, they're our greatest blessings in disguise. Some of you are in school right now, and you think the teacher is so terrible. I distinctly remember Mrs. Drew and Mr. Bales. Now, who is Mrs. Drew and Mr. Bales? Mrs. Drew was a teacher of mine in elementary school. Mr. Bales was a teacher in high school. And all of the students avoided Mrs. Drew and Mr. Bales because they were the toughest teachers in the whole school. But I learned more from Mrs. Drew and Mr. Bales than all of the other teachers put together. And I remember Mr. Bales in particular, and I remember a class, and he had a test, and I made a 41, not 42, 41. I made a 4. I remember, it's the only grade I can remember in my life, but I made a 41 on that test. And when I came back, I told my mother, said, boy, you done failed. I said, Mama, you don't understand. When Mr. Bell was passing out the test, he said, I've got to grade these on a curve. You don't know what the curve means. A curve is not absolute, it's relative, because everybody has done so bad, they got to change the whole scale. And Mr. Bell says, I've got to grade these tests on a curve because the highest score in the class was only a 41. That was me. I said, Mama, I got the highest score in the class. And Mama said, but you failed. See, this is the difference between how we view something and how God views. Lord, I'm doing better than they are. Lord, have mercy. Thank goodness I am not like that sinner over there because I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, and I'm not doing the other. Thank goodness I'm not like them. God will look at it and say, but what are you doing? Yeah, you're not doing what they, but what are you doing? What are you not doing that I have commanded you to do? See, we sometimes don't understand the tough things that God sends us through. They are the things that save our lives. They are the things that teach us. And here, Pharaoh was blessed beyond measure by the curse that God sent. And you're saying, how did that curse bless Pharaoh? You see, we know that Abraham's great blessing and promise from God was his seed, his descendants. God's promise to Abraham was basically, I will make your descendants like the stars in the sky. That's the main thing we know of Abraham. That's the main part of the Abrahamic promise. It wasn't so much for Abraham, even though he was greatly blessed. God's emphasis on Abraham was his seed would be blessed, and they would be multiplied like the stars in the sky. Why didn't you say, well, what has that got to do with Pharaoh? Because it's on your mind right now, so go ahead and say it. What has that got to do with Pharaoh? I'm going to tell you what that has got to do with Pharaoh. You see, the Bible gives you a clue and a key, but not the full story. And the reason it doesn't give you the full stories on a lot of stories, because there's too much to write. It's kind of like your own resume. You don't write all your stuff on your resume. Even if you write an autobiography, you can't put all the stuff that's happening in your life. And it's so much stuff that it's hard enough for us to get through the Bible as it is. It would fill up a whole book just to write the true details of Abraham's life. That wasn't all this stuff that happened to Abraham. I tell you all a lot of my personal stuff. Trust me, that's not all the stuff that happened to me. That's the abbreviated, filtered version. So oftentimes you've got the abbreviated, filtered version. That ain't the whole story. So the Bible just doesn't have enough. It's like the things that Jesus did, all the books in the earth couldn't hold it all. You can't put all of the stuff in there. So some of the stuff is abbreviated, and the Bible in particular is the story of the Jews and Jesus. So a lot of the rest of the stuff is just filtered out. It's cut out because it's just too much to even put in there. So the Bible is primarily the history of the Jews and Christ. But in Genesis chapter 12, beginning at 14th verse, and it came to pass that when Abram was coming to Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very fair. That means pretty. This woman was tough. She was a 10, a brick house. And then it says, the princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, some version says the officials of Egypt But the King James actually says the more accurate rendition of this word. The word prince in the Hebrew, actually, it's called nasi. It means an exalted one, a king or a sheik, the son of royalty. So when it says the princes of Egypt, it was really talking about Pharaoh's sons, saw Sarah, and went and told their daddy. Said, man, this woman here is just woo. Because see, Pharaoh had the toughest women in the kingdom. He was the king. So he had the prettiest women in all of the kingdom, and when they saw her, she was so beautiful, they went and told Pharaoh. The same thing that happened with Abimelech. When they just saw a beautiful woman, it was the law. The king got the first shot at her. Because if you took her and the king wanted her, the king just get you killed. So you knew if she was that pretty, give that woman to the king. So the princes, his sons, saw Sarah and went and told Pharaoh, and Pharaoh took her into his house and gave Abraham all this stuff. Now, this is the first use of the word prince in the Bible. Let me tell you the second use of the word prince in the Bible. That's in Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his